Okay, a lot of rich stuff there, huh? You were reminding me at that last piece, Chris, when you're talking about how vital it can be to change the way all those questions and hang-ups and barriers that exist in the mind of the unchurched. You can't get that from a book. You get that by just kind of being sensitive to, if you're around your dad and he's got a beef about somebody or something, you kind of know that it's always there. And you're aware of that. And if you're around people who are far from God, you start getting that built in. I really appreciate the way you walked through that. Karl Barth, famous Swiss theologian, used to say, every good preacher needs to have in one hand the Bible as the Word of God, and in the other hand, the newspaper, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to that about that cultural thing. And what I'm hearing you say is, maybe, just maybe, we need a third hand, or we need to sort of say, let's put the Bible in one hand, maybe a friend in another. And so let's talk about that. And I wanted to just sort of ask you this question about how important it really is to be with people. And I bet as we were talking about this, about having relationships as a preacher, there's some challenges with that sometimes, to have relationships. How many would say that you have some degree of challenge about this thing that he's talking about nurturing healthy, real relationships where you're just spending time with people who are far from God? How many would say, I identify with that, that's a bit of a challenge for me? Okay? All right? And the rest is either easy or you're so far gone you don't care. So that's okay. All right, so I'd like to just hear you guys maybe speak to that a little bit about the challenge you face in that regard, and maybe how important it is to you, maybe even a story that comes to mind from your own life about how that has changed your preaching because you've been able to be graced with a relationship of the kind that Chris described. Whoever's ready, grab that mic and jump in.
Well, this is my passion.
And be sure to speak up. This is not amplifying, so the guys in the back want to make sure we're speaking up, okay?
This is my passion.
It's a little better.
Sorry. I couldn't resist. I'm sorry. I'm on 3 chocolate bars. I apologize. All right. This is my passion. And so getting here, Chris, unpack all of this was just so rich. And Christ is the example of being culturally relevant without wimping out. And, you say of different, can you think of people or situations? And I'm just jotting down as you ask that. There's so many different benefits that come from doing what Chris said. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it would not have felt natural for me at all. And my hand would have been raised and I would have said, well, I would be a fish out of water. But if you want to improve your preaching, start hanging out with non-Christians. And I'll give you several examples here or thoughts, but I'll try to be brief. I'm going to try to give you 4 quickly if I can. When you start spending time with non-Christians, what happens is they start to see you as a person as opposed to as a preacher. I have business cards that are printed off. I've got them with me. I've never had a business card at Southeast in 23 years of serving there, but about a year ago or 6 months ago, I printed out business cards just so that I could give them out to people. And I could ask for prayer requests, and they have no idea I'm a preacher, and I do it on airplanes and restaurants and all sorts of different places. And I'm not one of these guys that tries to lead people to the Lord on the plane flight or, over a meal, but I want to forge that relationship, and I love it if they don't find out I'm a preacher for a while. Think of it like this. When people bring a guest up to meet you, let's say you lead a Bible study or you are a youth minister or you preach in a church, whatever category you might fall into. Have you ever had that person come up to you and say, this is my friend, this is Chris, and this one I've been telling you about, wink, wink, they're winking at you the whole time. Yeah, this is Chris, and they're emphasizing Chris, this is Chris. In other words, this is a guy who's an agnostic, or this is a guy who's so verbally abusive at work, or whatever the situation might be, and they just say, this is our preacher. This is Dave, man. He's funny. He's really funny. You're really going to like him, all right? And they go on and on. So you introduce yourself to the person, meet them. And then you go in, and while you're preaching, you watch this gal and her friend, or this guy and her friend, and his friend. And what happens is they listen more intently than they ever have. Have you ever noticed that? Your church member sits there, and they hang on every word you say. And if you say, turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 4. Well, I'm Luke chapter 4. They turn to Luke chapter 4. They sing like they've never sung before. They laugh at everything you say. Oh, that's good. He's good. I told you he's funny. He's funny. He's very funny. He's funny. That's good. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to use that with a word. Okay. They go through all of this. And then when it comes to the time when you're calling for a decision, they are leaning in. Well, what are they doing? They are filtering every single thing that you say. Everything that you say through the ears of their friend. And they want more than anything for that person to come to know Jesus the way they love Jesus. Now, what happens is when you have a guest who's coming with you, that starts to play on everything that you write down, everything that you say. I interviewed Lee Strobel a few years ago. He said, every line I write it for my brother Ray, who is a bigger atheist than I ever was. And so I write my line, and then I think, what would Ray say? Well, Ray would say, oh, yeah, but such and such. So in my next paragraph, I try to answer what Ray would say. And it makes you a better preacher. It makes you more empathetic. It makes you more careful rather than callous in the things you say. Let me give you three quick stories. Francine was a gal who was a radio disc jockey in our town at the 50,000 watt station. And I was on her show a time or two, and then she asked me, wanted to have lunch with me. Let's go out and have lunch together. She really enjoyed being with me. Let's have lunch. I said, well, you know what? I don't really do the lunch thing with ladies. I'm, sorry if that, but I just don't do that, and we don't. And well, I mean, that just threw her off, and she was upset about that. And she did an entire hour call-in show on me saying no to, and fortunately she didn't say who I was, but I called my wife and said, honey, tune in on the radio. Francine's talking about us. And so she ripped, and her favorite line she said about 4 times, I didn't want to go to bed with him. I just wanted to go to lunch with him. All right. So I'm feeling about this big, but we kept trying to forge a relationship with this gal, and she came to something at our church with us, and she got really excited about it. And she was very abrasive in her personality, and she was night and day from my sweet wife. But my wife and I felt some compulsion that we had to keep reaching out to her. And long story short, we started spending more and more time with her. She started coming to church with us. She would cuss openly right after a worship service was over down front. That's a bunch of BS. And we're like, no, please don't say that loud, all right? And even if you feel that way, please don't say that. And she would go on, and we kept trying to love her. And finally, she came to the point she wanted to be a part of the church. And she came forward. And then when it came time to talk to her about baptism, she got really upset because she had been baptized as a Catholic when she was an infant, and really got frustrated over that. So we went through some more teaching with her on that. And finally one day at a restaurant, she said, I'm ready to do it, and I want Beth to baptize me. And so Beth baptized her, and it was unbelievable, the night and day switch that took place. 6 months later, she went in the hospital at the age of 44 years old and died of an aneurysm. And at the funeral, I said to her mom, boy, I'd really like to talk about her baptism. And she said, well, I'd rather you not. I said, okay, I'll respect that. And just before the service started, which they broadcast on live television all over the city of Louisville and on the radio as well, her mom came to me and said, if you want to talk about that, you can, because that was her decision. and just the opportunities that have come. I've got 2 other stories from the last 2 weeks that I'm very excited about, but I'm going to monopolize the time.
You might have time to come back. So somebody else jump in on this question about how important it's been to you and this relationship with non-believers. Friendships.
Yeah, I think that I read a newspaper article I think last week that was talking about the difficulties it is for young adults, like once they start having families, to make deep and meaningful friendships. So like the idea that when you're a teenager, when you're in college, you make tons of friendships. It's kind of a natural thing that you do, and then after you graduate, you get married, you start having kids, all the mortgage, the responsibilities, then relationships are few and far between. There's not a lot of time to invest into friendships like you used to have. So everybody's what Chris said really resonated with me. Everybody really needs a friend. And I think more people feel that than what we realize, and so everybody's craving that sort of attention. So I think that's important. There's some unique challenges depending on what ministry context you're in. It doesn't matter if you're in a small church or a larger church. People still kind of see if you're the preacher at that church. There are some complications there with friendships, but that doesn't mean that we should isolate ourselves and not try to engage in those types of relationships.
Right there and say, okay, this is the panel here. Old school, a lot of the folks that mentored some of us in the room would have said, hey, in the church, I know, kind of just pause on this one right here. In the church, I was told, don't try to establish friendships, strong friendships with those in the church. It really just complicates things. That was kind of held as a view and what I was told. Your quick take on that, the one sentence, or it doesn't have to be one sentence, but a quick kind of response to that.
Well, I guess I could understand why they would say that. I would say it's you need friendships, obviously, with the right people, and so I think you shouldn't shut yourself off from all relationship. You're human. You need friendship with people, and you're also called to be into people's lives. So I don't see how you can isolate yourself off from relationships within the church.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard that too. I would say that's true if I restated it from the positive side and say it's really important for you to have good friends who aren't a part of your church. That's big. So I've got good church planner friends who aren't a part of our church, so we can talk about people behind their back, that sort of thing. And amen. Yes. And thank you for that, Dave. But I don't think you can't. You can also have friends in the church, but I want to say that humbly because I recognize that being a pastor of 50 people is slightly different from being a pastor of several thousand or 20,000.
Yeah, but I didn't say you're not close to everybody.
Not naming any names here, but just theoretically speaking. No, I think that you can't be friends with everybody. You can be close friends with some people, but that is going to be messy. But part of that mess is important because you sort of need to model how that works. How are you a part of a family that's 100 people or more, but you can't have 100 close friends? And everybody in your church needs to figure that out too. And there could be hurt feelings. It could be messy, but that's why we forgive each other. That's the kind of the hallmark of our faith. And you help model how to navigate that, how to find the people that you sort of naturally resonate with in this, but still are a part of the family, contributing part of the family.
Dave, your thoughts on friends in the church?
Yeah. Bob Russell had some really close friends in the church. He had a lot of close friends outside the church too. So I've seen that work. One strange thing in the transition of leadership that took place about 7 years ago was I had a whole lot of close friends on the staff at Southeast. But when I went from being the number 2 or the associate and went into this role, you start to understand why there's these books written, It's Lonely at the Top, and some of those things. So I don't know if it was self-inflicted on my own part, but I have fewer close friends than I did when I was one of the gang. And that comes with letting people go. That comes with challenging their work ethic and some of those things. But my closest friends are probably outside of the church. But I do have a couple of elders, plus a couple of other guys that I'm really good friends with in the church that I can let my hair down with.
Let's come back to Aaron. Were you going to finish up on one thing? I kind of jumped in the middle. Do you have more to say? Don't make it up if you don't. If you do, I want to be able to finish.
You know, I would say that I'm probably kind of I'm in a season of life right now that you know, I've got 4 small kids at home, and so I there's times where I don't know that I feel like I'm giving enough of myself to them or my wife. And then at the end of the day, go, okay, you know, what are the friendships that I've invested in? And I've got this one guy right now that has started coming to our church. He's a believer, but he's you know, interesting guy, relocated here from another state, wants to be my best friend. And I've tried to, you know, give him, you know, tried to invest in. He lives in my neighborhood, and he texted me 3 weeks ago, Saturday night, 10:30 at night, just blasted me on text, and just out of the blue, and just said, "You're not spending enough time with me. I'm so disappointed in our friendship." You know, it's just like, I'm just sitting there reading through it, and I'm like, it's Saturday night, you know, and I just about popped him back, and I was like, no, I'm just gonna let that sit.
Aaron, I'm really sorry.
I know it was bad. We're doing better.
I'll take it back.
I don't know how many times you've sent me texts like that, Ben. It's just really irritating.
You're not with me, and that's all.
But the court order, I guess, doesn't say. But anyway, so like, hey, you know, the next morning I just said, I texted him back and said, "Hey man, I'm not trying to diss you. You know, I love you. We'll have to talk about this later." And he texted me back and said, "Man, I really felt convicted all night long that I did that to you." And so we've still not had a conversation about it. But every time I see him, I'm like, am I spending enough time with this guy? And you know, it's like, oh my word. And so there's that whole kind of, I probably am the most perplexed right now that I've ever been in life, because we've got a large staff that I'm not fully giving myself to everybody. Everybody in the church everybody thinks I'm busy, so nobody wants to bother me. So I hear that all the time. The number one thing Lindsay has said to her when people run into her at Target is, "I know Aaron's really busy, so I'll tell you." And so she gets overloaded with stuff. And so then I go outside of that and say, okay, now who am I building friendships with that are outside the church that are not believers? And I just feel really deeply convicted over it. So who lives next door to us? It's a homosexual couple. And so I'm really thankful God's placed them there, because it doesn't take much for me to walk outside and they're there. And they know who I am, and we've actually built a great relationship with them. We've exchanged cell phone numbers, and we water their trees when they're gone in the summer, and they've done stuff for us, and it's actually been a great relationship. So we've actually asked God to kind of place some of those divine relationships in front of us. But I'll be very honest, it's a struggle, you know, where we're at right now. And to know who to trust. That's my wife's number one fear. She's like, I'm so afraid that I'm going to let my hair down and say something to somebody that I shouldn't, and they're going to use it against you. And so, anyway.
Seems like it's probably somewhat universal, the struggle for those in ministry, for the friendships, and this has been, it seems like a really healthy kind of, again, the balance issue. Chris really helping us see how important it is, not just because it'll make our preaching better, but it seems like it'll make us more of the Christ followers we need to be, to have relationships with those who are far from God, and to be nurturing those intentionally is a great action point. And then this struggle that it is, and the messiness of it in the church. And I know some of you could probably tell stories where you've had deep, really wonderful, rich relationships in the church. And that's been somewhat my case, but I also relate to everything that you guys were saying about the challenges and sometimes the pain of that. And yet, I also relate to the boy, you know, I know you want to be my best friend, but right now my son needs me to be his best friend. And so, again, we just pray for the grace of God to help us in this, and I think it'll help the preaching task. Let me just, before we take our break, let me ask one more question to you guys, and let's try to short answer this as much as you kind of can in a bullet fashion if you're able. The topic was context, right? Preaching in context, and I'm looking around, I'm guessing we have a range of context here. What I think Chris shared with us is probably true universally, that this friendship thing and looking and loving, which is so great the way you said that sells everywhere, and that's important for all of us. We do have someone who's really in an urban setting, and two that are more or less suburban. So I'd like, lots been written about this. There are some unique things about the context of those who live in an urban setting that does kind of inform our preaching. I'm looking around the room, I see a number of urban preachers, and I'm also seeing some suburbans. So since we've got both, let me just put it to you this way. Talk about a couple of things, just the first couple of things that come to your mind to say, well, I know because I'm in a suburban context or because I'm in an urban context, there's a couple of things that I think are unique to my context. I want to make sure that I'm addressing this need, this issue, this perspective, this kind of wacky way of thinking. And let's just kind of bullet a couple of those things that are kind of there in our context that will probably help us, and then we'll wrap up and take our break. So when you're ready, just grab the mic and jump in. Something unique that you know because of urban or suburban. This is a need that screams out that we do have to address and be contextually specific to getting to.
One just, I guess, quick thing in a suburban environment, we just know that, I know that there's lots of loneliness. So there's people that are, they've kind of settled into this kind of grind. They're driving in somewhere to work, and then they're paying the mortgage, and I watch my neighbors pull in, open up the garage door, pull in, shut the garage door, kind of isolation. So there's a great deal of monetary wealth really wedded with a disconnect and loneliness. And then I think social media has kind of then supplanted a lot of that. So they're kind of trying to replace some of that deep community with social media contact. So I know that's something
Powerful combination: materialism, isolation, loneliness, all sort of anti-Christ right there. Okay, urban, New York, Manhattan, I'm sure all those play, but you probably have some unique things as well.
Yeah, I'd say the unique thing is that where I am, people don't know an actual Christian person, typically. So their idea of what it means to be Christian, if it's informed at all, it's been informed by media, almost exclusively. So you can just imagine what they think. So, and then like a pure naivety or ignorance in the way that you talked about it, Aaron, of the gospel and the things of a biblical worldview. So it means every time I talk about anything, my guard has to be up to explain it as if I'm encountering it for the very first time, because they are. And so I can't take anything for granted, especially because I believe it. Like the devil. I buy the whole biblical picture of it, that he is a powerful, angelic being, that he is evil in the world, that he condemns us, accuses us, and makes all kinds of awful things happen, and that he is more like a person than anything else we could understand. He has a personality. I buy the whole thing. But that sounds super wonky if you don't even, so you believe in spiritual beings. So you have to kind of back up. Or heaven. I buy the whole thing about heaven. Eternal, you'll be there, you'll be yourself, more yourself than you ever dreamed you could be, all that. But I'm talking to people who haven't even really decided whether they believe there's anything that happens after you die. So you always sort of have to back up and at least acknowledge that, so this is kind of where I'm coming from. You're hearing this idea for the first time, especially with things that can come across as comical, like spiritual warfare, or have been presented in comical kind of ways. Kind of give them their due and take a moment saying, I know that sounds outrageous, but just consider how it explains the way things work in the world, and kind of go that way. But just sort of acknowledge those people are in the room. So I'd say sort of a skepticism, but I don't mean a hardness. I just mean I've never heard that before, or I've never considered the world that way before. A naivety and ignorance and a true multiculturalism. People in the city have encountered everything. So they know people who are Orthodox Jews and Hindus, and they know people who are on food stamps. And so you really can't be cavalier about any kind of stereotypes, because you won't get away with it, because people know these people. So you sort of you have to be knowledgeable, and if you're not, humble and admit that you're not, because people will call you on it in a second.
I don't know if mine are very different from suburban to urban. I will say I live in the Bible Belt, so it's a little different. I got a phone call this morning to be on an early morning TV station in a couple of weeks to talk about Christmas in 3 2-minute segments. And, I doubt that happens in the Northeast as much, And And I'll preface that by the fact I have no idea what the guy might say and what route the interview might take. But you know, my secretary said, "Man alive, it's at 5:30. Is your first one and your last one's at 7:20? I mean, you really want to do that?" I said, "No, I hate to do something like that. But if I got somebody who's going to ask me about Christmas, and I can talk about it for 2 minutes, and I get 3 cracks at it, I can't turn that down. I might have to stay up all night just so that I'm, you know, lucid enough to speak. But I can't pass that up." Aaron alluded to some of the things that we struggle with in our area. Is loneliness. I think it is. There's a lot of hurts and there's a lot of addictions. The difference between some places and the suburbs of Louisville is that we have people who have become really good at pretending, and they hide it well. I remember when Paul Williams came one time to Louisville, and he and I were driving around. He said, "You know what? I never see that in New York City." And I said, "What?" "I just never see that." "What?" "Well, thank you." And it was a fish emblem on the back of a car. And we got them all over the place. And he's like, "You just wouldn't find that in New York City." I said, "Well, because you got all taxis." You know, I mean, that's why. But so it's a different culture. But here's what we struggle with. We struggle with being in the Bible Belt and a lot of Christian people, but they don't live the same way on the week that they do on the weekend, on Saturday night at church or Sunday morning. And that's what shoots us in the foot. Because when you try to lead someone to Christ and they say, "Oh, well, such and such goes to your church," and you can just see the wheels turning, that's what they equate with Christianity. And I always love it when somebody says, "Oh, I work with somebody from your church." Or yesterday I saw a chiropractor and he said, "Oh, I know somebody who goes to your church." And you always cringe. You're like, "Oh, be somebody good." You know, please, not the Wilsons, you know. And he said, "Mike and Mary Seaward." And I'm like, "Thank you, Lord." "Oh, yes, they're really great folks." "Oh, they're super folks. They're great folks. Boy, wow, what a great representation they are." "Yes, they are," you know. And everyone's like them, you know. So I think the consistency would be what we continually come back to and try to challenge. And the only way that happens is by us modeling that. And when we talked earlier about the reaching out and building some friendships with non-Christians, the only thing I would say is it is very difficult for you to teach a class or lead a Bible study and to talk about sharing your faith if no one ever sees any visitors seated next to you. And my experience has been that when I see a visitor with someone, I'm going to make a beeline to that person. Or if someone sees that there's somebody sitting with us, it's amazing how people will something kicks in and they'll just come up and say, "Hey, good to have you. Is this your first time here? Or are you visiting with us?" And I don't even need to say anything to them afterwards, because there'll be people that just start coming up and they got their antenna up for that. But if they see you doing that and then you teach about it or challenge them to do that, they'll be much more apt to do it if they see you modeling the way.
That's great stuff. Great stuff. Really, really important. Appreciate you guys' insight on all that.